Well, for those of you who have kind of been jumping in for the last 3 weeks, thank you for joining us and being a part of it. And here's the thing. I know for me personally, I thought back about last week. Lori and I both got in the car, and our kids are grown up. And I said this one of the first weeks. I said, what happens with the passage that we're looking at is that those of us who have kids that have grown up will feel like we're getting beaten. We're getting punched. And there's a whole lot of shoulda, woulda, couldas that come out. And so we both talked about how we felt that. But I want us to understand that for those of us who have kids who have grown, don't focus on that. We're going to open up this last part, and it's going to help make some sense. But then those of us who maybe don't have kids, we've been kind of going, this week has nothing to do with me. This series doesn't make any sense. And I want to remind you that just a few weeks ago, we did a little illustration using this string right here. And we talk about, in fact, what we see in the Bible is that the command that God gave to the Israelites, and we talked about this the very first week, that God gave to the Israelites was not for parents exclusively. It was for everyone. It was for everyone, all of Israel. No matter whether they had kids or they didn't have kids, it was their responsibility to help raise kids faithfully or raise them right. And maybe you're one of those individuals who you've gotten disconnected from your kids, or maybe something tragic has happened and you've lost a child. And those can be difficult, and so the last few weeks could have been bringing back some memories that are difficult to wrestle with. And I want to pray for you, pray for peace for you, because I know that can be difficult, but at the same time, this is for all of us. I've heard from many parents that have kids right now, and many of you have responded and said, man, this has been a great 3 weeks because it's helped me see some things. It's helped me zero in on some things. It's helped given me some focus. And so for each of us, I just want us to kind of remember where we started. We talked about how in Deuteronomy 6, it says to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And that is our responsibility to raise kids to understand what that means. And so for every single one of us, whether we have kids or we don't, whether we are current parents, going to be parents, or never want to ever be parents, ever, or maybe we're grandparents or great-grandparents and we are doing all the things that are kind of like a payback for our kids when they were a problem. Whatever that looks like, we have a responsibility. It's a church's responsibility to care for kids. And so we're going to be finishing up the series this morning, and today we're going to look at the last part of Proverbs chapter 22:6. But every week I've also tried to give a story. I've also tried to share something from a biblical perspective, a story from the Bible that maybe isn't a good example of parenting. But I will tell you, those are few and far between and almost impossible to find because there weren't any perfect parents. Adam and Eve, think about it. They're the first parents ever. They actually got to walk and talk with God, and what did their son do? Murdered the other one, right? I mean, that's not a good... Sometimes I wonder if Adam and Eve struggled with, man, where did we go wrong with Caleb? What's the deal with that kid? And maybe they just like, all right, God, he's yours. You know, I don't know. I don't know what they went through. Think about Joseph and Mary. They are given the Son of God, and they lose him. They lose him for 3 days. Can you imagine that conversation? There's not too many perfect parents in the Bible. There's very few that we're going to find. A few years ago, we talked about the story of Samson. If you're one of those parents who is really wrestling with where your kids are at or what they're doing in their faith, maybe you're like me and you look back at last week and you go, okay, my verse for my kids was 3 John 1:4. I find there's no greater joy than to see my children walking in the gospel. And maybe you're looking back last week and you're like, man, I don't know if they're walking. I don't know where they're at in their faith. I know I have moments like that as a dad because I have this idea of what it looks like, and it's always much further and much different than even what I'm living. Samson's parents were terrible parents. They started off right. They started off raising their kid. They dedicated their son to be a follower of God, but also dedicated him as a Nazarene, as a Nazarite who would not cut his hair, who would not do certain things, who would not be around dead things. And yet, what did he do? He ended up getting his hair cut. He ended up doing all the things that he shouldn't do. In fact, as parents, there are many times when they encouraged it. Have you ever been around those parents? Have you ever seen those parents who are encouraging the bad behavior in their kids? If you do sports, you know those parents, right? Where you know that the action that they're doing is only causing it to get worse. You know the parents that yell at their kids and their kids yell back and the parents are acting like, why are they yelling at me? Oh, I don't know, maybe because that's what you're doing. You know, there's like these moments when you can see people, and it's always other parents, it's not us, right? It's like, well, they're the ones doing that. They're really encouraging their kid to do this. But we see all throughout the story of Samson that his parents were actually, they dedicated him. They said there's certain laws and rules that you need to follow, and yet they helped him circumvent those laws and those rules. And they excused his behavior, and they enabled him to be not so faithful. And then there's this moment at the end of his life when everything is fallen apart, where he finally sinks in about the faithfulness of God. Remember that one word I shared with you guys last week? For all of us, whether we're parents or whether we're not parents, as a church family, it's faithfulness. If there's one word, if there's one way to raise our kids, it's faithfully. That doesn't mean perfectly, it means faithfully. Do as much as we can to point them to the faithfulness of God. There's this one moment for Samson when he recognizes that God has always been faithful. And his life ends tragically, but it ends faithfully. And he is seen in the Hebrew culture as a hero of the faith, and yet when you look at his life, he didn't display a whole lot of faithfulness up until that point. And so I think when we look at stories like this, it helps us to understand that the expectation is not that we're perfect, but that we're faithful. That we're faithful wherever we're at, whoever we are, and whatever we can do. Let me go through some just quick reviews so that before we jump into this last part, because it'll help us understand this. Remember, I've been giving you different phrases, different ideas, that maybe principles that you might apply into your family's life that will help you remember what your role is. Maybe you're a volunteer. Maybe you're helping out in children's ministry. Maybe you're helping out in junior high or high school ministry and you volunteer there. These things are great for you to remember because they're based off of biblical principles, but they're also things that make sense in a kid's life as you raise them, as you encourage them. So no one can do alone what we can do do better together. I've said Deuteronomy 6 is a great example of that it was an expectation of the children of Israel that everyone do this, but I would encourage you to do this. Next month, we're going through the book of Psalms. We're going to be looking at different Psalms, the way that they are put together, and they're focused on the gospel. I'd encourage you to look at Psalm 78. I'm not going to get a chance to do it this year, but Psalm 78, I would encourage you to go to that Psalm and read that one, because I'll just tell you what it is. It's a command from God to always be faithful in raising the next generation. It's an expectation that generation is being encouraged and grown up. Number two, widen the circle of influence with the right people. We did that a couple weeks ago, and then last week, how kids see Jesus determines how they see themselves. And so when it comes to each of these principles, I want you to just kind of keep those in mind, because those are foundational to raising kids the right way. Those are foundational for us as a church to pour into families and into kids, especially as we're looking forward to this new individual coming on. We want him to know that we care about the kids, that he's not just doing his own thing and just separate from us, that we need to support him and encourage him and him and his family any way that we can. And so that'll be a big part of it. I think what's happened, though, as we get ready to look at today's principle, what's happened is we have been programmed to look at the negative. Think about how much of our media is always focused on the negative things. Think about how often we go to the parent-teacher conference, and maybe how rarely it is that the teacher says, yeah, they're doing this great, or maybe they say, yeah, they did good here, but this is another area they have to work on. There's something that's been conditioned in all of us when we go to a boss, when we go to a supervisor, that they're telling us what we could do better. We've been conditioned to always be focused on the negative. I want to give you this. Some of us have been so programmed to see what is wrong, especially about our kids, that we have forgotten how to see what is right. We've been so programmed to see what is wrong with our kids. Parents, we do this, right? When our kids when we're getting ready to take our kids and drop them off somewhere, or drop them off, or a babysitter's coming over, what do we tell our kids? Okay, don't do this, don't do that, don't do everything. And then we start to kind of get back and we kind of go, man, I hope they behave. We're always looking for them, whatever they're doing wrong. So let me give you the fourth principle. And this one's the biggest one, and then we're going to tear apart the last part of this passage. Here it is. Ready? Fight for the heart. Remember, it's our job to fight for the heart. Fight for the heart. And I got that from Reggie Joyner. He's a great children's ministry leader and has done some really good things. In fact, he and his organization are the ones that put together our curriculum, Orange Curriculum. And they've also established a thing. You kind of see there's a wall out there called the Just a Phase wall with all kinds of stuff. We'll talk about that in a second. But they did years and years of research and trying different things within their ministries and within his opportunities, and he's gotten a huge team of people that are always pouring into him. And this is one of their principles that they put with not just within the curriculum, but they say is one of the most important ones for all of us, for churches, when it comes to reaching other people or helping other people understand who God is. You're not fighting with them, you're fighting for their heart. Because you want their heart to know who God is and understand who God is. Remember the commandment that God gave, love the Lord God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength? Back then, when God told Moses to tell the people of Israel this, sometimes what we focus on is what Jesus said later on. It said the greatest commandment. The commandment for us is to love God with all of our heart, soul, mind, and strength. But what we don't realize is that what God was telling the people of Israel and what Jesus was telling us and telling the people who were asking him what the greatest commandment was, this loving God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength is not about you. It's a reminder, just like communion, just like other things that we practice, it's a reminder of God's faithfulness. Remember, God was faithful to you, Israelites. This is what Moses was saying. God was faithful to you even when you weren't being faithful to him. And so because he is faithful to you, he is going to give you the desire, the draw to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. He's loved you with all of his heart, soul, mind, and strength. And he's going to give you the ability to do the same. When Jesus says that, he's saying, leaders, you've missed the mark. You've forgotten what the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Remember, God has still been faithful to you. See, I think what we find out is that what we see in Deuteronomy, what we see in even the words of Jesus is it's all about God's faithfulness. It's always been about God's faithfulness. God has always been faithful. And that should stir something in us. You see, there's a big difference between fighting with somebody and fighting for somebody. If you're fighting with somebody, if you're fighting against somebody, you're trying to convince them, you're trying to tell them that what they're doing is wrong or how they should change. But when you're fighting for their heart, you're moving them, you're trying to urge them to see how much God loves them. You're trying to let them remember how God has been faithful, how God has always been pursuing them. See, because we're made in the image of God, and because we have a heavenly Father who has a crazy love for us as his kids, we can have a crazy love for our kids. Have you ever thought about that? That you have you ever noticed just how much you just love your kids? If you have kids, you just have there's just this thing you're like, man, I just can't help it. I just love them. The only reason why we have the ability, maybe you have served in ministry and you helped kids at VBS, or maybe you serve every week and help lead kids in Sunday school classes, or maybe you help in the small groups with junior high or high school or 5th and 6th grade, whatever that is. Do you know why you do that? It's not because somebody asked you. That might have initiated something, but there was something already stirring inside of you. It was because of God's love for you that you can love others. Remember what it says in 1 John chapter 4, we love because he first loved us. We do not have the ability to love apart from God. We do not have the ability to point anyone in faithfulness towards God unless we first experience God's faithfulness in us. So that brings us to Proverbs chapter 22. If you have your Bibles, you can turn there with me. Proverbs chapter 22, we're going to look at one of the verses there. And I think what we need to understand as we get ready to open this up is that I've given several examples over the last few weeks, several illustrations to try to help us see what our role is. Remember, we started off with the marbles, right? And we said every moment matters. That we've got to make the most of every opportunity we have, because slowly but surely we're all losing our marbles. Every week we lose another marble. And if you look at the display out there, you realize that by the time your kid is getting into their senior year, by the time they turn 17, you only have 52 weeks left. And that can be convicting, that can be difficult, that can be depressing, but it should be exciting and exhilarating, because that means, man, I've got 52 weeks left. I've got 51 weeks left. Every moment matters. I'm going to make the most of this moment. And we can point our kids in the right way. And then we talked about the string, right? I'm not going to unravel this again because it was already a pain putting it back on here. But remember, we spread out the string of all these moments where people have maybe connected with us or helped us understand who God is, or helped in our spiritual growth. And then some of us had string and some of us didn't. And then all of a sudden at the end, all of us had a hold of it. And we made this kind of big, huge web. And the idea is that all of us have a connection to being used by God to help raise kids faithfully. And that even just the fact of praying with parents for the heart of their kids is a huge part of that process. And then we talked about the cones last week. And we kind of showed how we, as parents and as leaders and as a church, we can we know what the rules of the road are. We know where the guardrails are. We know where the speed limit is. We know where the stoplights are and where the stop signs are, and the things that God has already put in place that are important for us to follow. But as people that care about our families and our kids, sometimes we have to lay out some cones to protect them, because this kid is going to take a corner a little too fast, and this kid drives way too fast, and this kid tends to skip the stop sign. And so you might need to, as a parent or as a leader, find ways to kind of cone off certain areas to redirect them. This week, Proverbs 22:6, look at this, follow with me. Last part of it. Train up a child in the way he should go, and even when he is old, he will not depart from it. We start off with train up. We focused on that phrase, train up a child. And that really is the idea of discipleship. It's this idea of hand in hand leading those individuals that we are discipling towards Christ, towards a relationship with Jesus, to what it looks like to walk with God. Then we talked about the second part of that verse, in the way they should go. And we remembered that in John 14, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and life. No one can have a relationship with God except through me. And so now we know where we need to lead people toward in the way that they should go. Now we get to will not depart from it. And I think at first glance, when you look at this is the part that is convicting for us. Because if we have kids or we've seen kids, I was a youth pastor for 25 years, and I know the kids that seem, and I feel like have fallen from their faith. I see the posts, I see what they're doing, I see how they're acting and how they're behaving. And what happens in my mind and what I have to wrestle with is, man, where did I miss it? It's all those shoulda, woulda, couldas that start coming into my mind. And so for us, we look at that, and it's good for us to look at it this way. It's good for us to see that on the surface it looks like, well, they won't turn aside from it. They won't turn into a different direction. But I don't think that's a very complete understanding of that passage. Because when you start to break apart the Hebrew language and you start to understand how it's structured and how certain things are phrased a certain way that might mean something different in English than it did for them, I want you to see this. You see, the phrase that they will not depart from it is actually better, in order that they will not depart. In order that they won't depart. But as you begin to understand how these things are structured, even in our Bible, sometimes when it gets translated into English, it can start to kind of not make as much sense. In Hebrew, there's actually two words that are switched there. The word it and the word, sorry, I got to look at this again. The word it and the word him can be switched. It doesn't change any meaning from our side, but it should read this way. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he gets older, it will not depart from him. Well, what is the it? That's what we want to understand. What is the it? What is it that he won't depart from? Is it from the training? Yes. But what are we training them for? Well, it goes back to the word last week that we used, faithfulness. And it's not our faithfulness, although that's an example to them, but it's really what we're training our children up, what we're training them up. If you want to know the right way to train kids, is to train them up in how God has been faithful. So notice how that kind of changes a little bit of meaning for us. Train a child up in the way they should go, God's faithfulness, and how he's always been faithful for them and faithful to them. Not just Jesus' death on the cross. That's a big one. That is the big one. But there's so many other ways that he's been faithful. Train your child up in the way they should go, and God's faithfulness will not depart. The faithfulness of God will not be separated from them. He will continue to be faithful to them, and they will have a better chance of seeing it. I think the illustrations that we kind of have, we've used different ones, but it's like driving. If you've ever taught a kid how to drive a car, you're teaching them, parents, just you young parents, you're teaching your kids how to drive. Even as you leave today, you're teaching them how to drive. They're watching. They're seeing what you're doing. They're noticing how you maybe don't stop at all the stop signs, or you push the speed limit a little bit, or you give a fun wave to that driver that just cut you off. Those little moments, right? You're teaching your kids about driving, and then by the time they hit 15, 16, you don't just go, okay, here's the keys, good luck, and walk away. Maybe some of us did that with our kids. Good luck learning it. But I think a lot of us probably got in the car with them and took them to a parking lot and showed them how to push on the gas. Did anyone grow up learning how to drive a stick shift? Yeah, very few kids know how to do that at all now. But remember when you were being taught how to do that, and you were taken to the parking lot and you had to figure out how to get the gas off the clutch and put it on the gas at the same time, and it would start and stop and start and stop. You see, we're training our kids up. And there's this moment when they learn how to do it, and pretty soon you start stepping away, and pretty soon they're driving away on their own. JL, I'm going to pick on her for a minute because she's not here. But we had been, she'd been 15 and a half is when she could start driving with us, and so we'd take her on different things. We'd let her drive different places. And on her 16th birthday, she gets her driver's license. And she and Abby decide they're going to go to the store together. It's a great moment. We finally get to drive on our own. We don't have to have parents in the car with us. And so they get into the car. They pull out of our driveway. And it was maybe about 2 minutes after they had left that Abby walks in the door. And Abby goes, Dad, do you have some duct tape? And I'm going, oh, what happened? Walk outside. And what's happened is when she pulled out of the driveway, she turned to go down the street, but she clipped the edge of our Suburban. No major damage, just broke the fender was kind of falling off, and Abby was going to duct tape it back on without telling me what she was doing. So I fixed it, and we still laugh about it, and I feel bad for Jael because the first day that she's ever driven, the first moment, she's already wrecking the car. But she learned. You see, when your kids get a little bit older and they start leaving the home, what you've been teaching them about God's faithfulness, they have a better chance of seeing God's faithfulness and practicing God's faithfulness. And yes, there's going to be moments when they have accidents. There's going to be moments when things happen and when tragedy happens, when something that is their fault or not their fault happens. What are they going to bounce back to? What is going to be their duct tape? It's God's faithfulness. It's God's faithfulness. You want them to remember that and think about that. I love what Russell Moore and Philip Bethencourt say in Christian-centered parenting. They said this: children are divine stewardship. They are not for us to own, but for us to love. Carefully guide and then release to God's providential care. We cannot pressure, bully, or force them into faith. We parent not with anticipation of some promised outcome, but out of the faithfulness to Jesus, leaving the outcome to Him. You see, you can't be perfect parents. You can't parent your kids perfectly, but you can be faithful in raising your kids. We can be faithful in raising our kids, in letting them see God's faithfulness. I think this is a bad example, So don't quote me on this, but it kind of makes sense. How many of you put in a raffle ticket for the truck at Doggy Days? Yeah, some of you. How many of you put in more than one? Okay, a few of you. You know why you put in more than one. There's a better chance that you'll win it, right? One, my dad always would say, you just need one. It just takes one to win. I'm like, yeah, but I know how statistics work. If there's only 100 people that put in something, if there's only 100 tickets and I put one ticket in, I have a 1 in 100 chance. But if I put 50 tickets in, I have a 50 in 100 chance. I have a much better chance. It's almost the same thing, that the more opportunities, the more time, the more moments that we represent and focus on God's faithfulness and let our kids see that and let the people we're around see God's faithfulness. This is for all of us. The more we do that, the more potential it is that they will understand God's faithfulness, the more their heart opens up to God's faithfulness because they have that example in front of them all the time. And just like Samson, maybe they don't get it until just before. Maybe they don't get it until long after we're gone. Maybe they don't understand it. But there's a moment when God's faithfulness will show up, and they will be reminded of all those moments that God has been faithful and all the examples they've been given. See, the more firsthand experiences a child has to walk with God while they are with you, the more potential there is that they will walk with God when they aren't with you. That's the focus of that 3 John 1:4 verse. And I've kind of turned it a little bit to be more personal for me and my kids. But that was really the purpose of 3 John is, I have no greater joy than to see my children walking in the gospel, living out the gospel. So you know what I'm going to do until that moment when they are able to walk in the gospel on their own, when they're able to drive away on their own? I want to, as often as possible, as much as possible, walk in the gospel. And I'm not going to do it perfectly, and they need to see how imperfect I am and how faithful God still is, even though I'm not perfect. See, God has proven to be faithful. He can be trusted with our hearts and our minds and our souls and our strengths and everything we're able to do. So when we do whatever we can to remain faithful to Him, our kids, the people around us, the families around us, they see that. Their heart change begins with our heart change. It's never too late for us to fight for their heart. It's never too late. It doesn't matter how old your kids are or if you've never had kids. It's never too late to be fighting for the heart of kids and families and people around us. It's never too late for that. So let me give you some things. How do I make a permanent imprint on the heart? Let me give this to you. First of all, I'm going to talk to you as parents, those of you who are parents of kids. How do you make one of those permanent imprints on the life of your kid about God's faithfulness? How do I do that? And there's a whole bunch of things I could come up with. I tried to narrow it down to 3 specific ones. You can do this in your notes. First one is be patient. Be patient. See, here's a thought. Our capacity to love our kids and our family and the church is purposely connected to our love for God. God's love is patient with us. God has been patient with us. And so one of the ways that we can imprint God's faithfulness is to show patience, is to be patient with our kids. Change is a process. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. Change takes time. Many of us have experienced that. Remember, parents, you are raising little sinners. They're going to do what little sinners do. They're going to sin. And hopefully as they get older, they're not sinning as much as they used to. They might be sinning differently and maybe in bigger ways that you wish they wouldn't. But the goal is always to help them see God's faithfulness so that as they get older, they see that sin separates them from from them being faithful to God. But God is still faithful. A massive part of patience is our prayer. That we can be praying for the heart of our kids. Parents, if you have young kids, even if you have just a little baby, just a few months or weeks old, you can be praying for their heart change. I remember Lori would tell me that about each of the girls, but especially Jael. That we had these moments when Jael was younger. Her 2s and 3s, she was very stubborn. She was a very stubborn child, and so the name Jael means courageous, and it kind of shows some stubbornness too. And it's taken from the story of Jael in the Bible, a lady who was courageous and drove a tent stake through a guy's head. Pretty cool story. We'll look at that some other day. But Lori, in her mind, when she's going through this moment as a parent in jail, she would not cry when you swatted her. She would not. There was no punishment that was good that would do anything to her. She didn't care, and she would look at you like, while you're sleeping, I'm going to get you. And there was this part of it where Lori and I would say, hey, are you going to stay awake tonight? Because I don't know what jail's going to do. But I remember Lori telling me, and I started doing this because Lori was telling me that she was doing this, and I started doing it with her. That she would pray that stubbornness would be a stubbornness for God. And what I've seen in jail is that's she's kind of stubborn for God. She gets around some people that sometimes you go, I wouldn't hang out with those kind of people. And her faith does not falter. She stays faithful to God, and then she looks for moments to point those people to Jesus, to invite them to see who Jesus is. Prayer is a huge part of it. I think another part of patience is repetition. Repetition is a key. You have to be patient with it. You have to repeat it. You have to look for God's faithfulness and then repeat it to your kids over and over and let them see God's faithfulness over and over. Find ways to repeat it as often as you can. Let them see God's faithfulness for you. Repeat that. Look for those moments where God is being faithful. Let me give you a second one. Be patient. Secondly, be changed. I think this is a big one for parents. You can't expect their heart to be changed if you haven't been changed by your relationship with Jesus. If you are not any different because of Jesus, you can't expect your kids to be any different because of Jesus either. And that's a gut punch moment for us. But when your kids see that you're being changed by God and you're sharing with them how God has been changing you, there's appropriate times to talk about certain things in your life, and there's inappropriate times. When they're younger, there's certain things that you don't need to tell them about your lifestyle, maybe before Jesus, right? But as they get older, there's more conversations. I remember Lori had a conversation with her parents. It was a few years after we were married, and she started telling them some of the things she was doing in high school. And her mom was like, what? You came home that night that way? She came home drunk one night or whatever. And she goes, I can't believe that. And there was all these moments. But what opened up was these conversations of how God had been changing Lori's parents and how God had changed Lori. And that translates to how our kids learn and how they see God changing us. And that those things in the past, God was still faithful, and those things aren't good for us, and they hurt us, and they harm our relationships, and they harm our relationship with God. And it's been a great example that Lori's been able to, she's not going to tell her younger kids some of those moments. But as they got older and they started going to, maybe they had a friend invite them to a party or whatever, and we're wrestling with how do we talk to our kids about what not to do, she was able to open up and say, this is where you can break our hearts. You can break God's heart. You can make decisions they're going to hurt your relationship with God. Don't be afraid to share with your kids how walking with Jesus has changed you. Let me ask you this. How has God's faithfulness changed you? Share that with your kids. Be changed. And third, last one, be trustworthy. Be trustworthy, worthy of trust. That doesn't mean you have to be perfect. In fact, trustworthiness oftentimes is being able to admit when you've done something wrong, when you've reacted the wrong way, when you've responded in a way that is not trustworthy. Help them experience how they can trust you now so that they know how they can trust you later. If they see you trusting Jesus, they will know that they can trust Jesus. I would encourage you parents too, those of you as parents, if you guys have a chance, as you're walking out the door, maybe you've got a kid that's a 2-year-old or a baby, or maybe you've got a junior high or a high school or whatever phase they're in. These books are really incredibly helpful. They'll give you some more tips and tools, and you'll get some of those ideas you might see in some of those. But also, I would just encourage you, grab one of those on your way out, or whatever ones for whatever age your kids are. We'll get more if we have to. But these are huge, a huge resource that we want to make available to you as parents so that you know what to do. Now, that's parents. Let me focus on the rest of us as a church family. Because we need to remember that it's not just parents who are raising kids, but it's also us. So how can we, and it's not just kids, it's people. The same principles that we put into raising kids, or that parents put into kids, we can put into raising or connecting people with who Jesus is. We are always discipling somebody somewhere. Think about that. You are always discipling somebody somewhere. Where are you discipling them towards? It is, so how can we make an imprint on the people around us that they see God's faithfulness through us? Let me give you 3. Be positive. Be positive. Be positive. Be encouraging about what's going on at your church. Be encouraging about what's going on in your life. The more we focus on the negative, the more we talk about an individual that maybe isn't doing something we like, the more that we downplay the leadership in a church, the more that we say negative things about people around us, the more we point people away from Jesus. The more we gossip, the more we talk down about people we maybe don't agree with, the more we point people away from Jesus. Because if Jesus isn't changing how you view others and changing how you talk about others, then why would he change anyone else? That's how people on the outside see it. If Jesus isn't changing you and how you talk about people, how's that going to be any different? We need to be positive. We need to be encouraging. We need to be uplifting. We need to talk about the good things, the way that God is faithful. Not that I wish God would be more faithful on this, because he's not doing what I want him to do. He's not fixing this person. He's not changing this person. I don't like what they're doing. We have to focus on the positive. Be positive. Second, be prayerful. Prayerful. Prayer is all about heart change. It's not about trying to convince God to give us something that we want. We're praying for Eddie, right? We're praying for Eddie and that everything heals, and that's a good thing. We're praying that the doctors know what to do. But you know what we're really praying for? We're really praying that our hearts are in tune with God's heart, that he cares as much for Eddie. He cares more for Eddie than we ever could, and we want our hearts to be moved that direction as well. That's why we pray for people that are sick. Yes, we pray for healing. Yes, we pray for the doctors. Yes, we pray for all that. But we are, more than anything, we are praying so that our hearts will be in tune with God's heart towards that individual. Prayer is more about seeing things the way God sees rather than getting God to see the things the way we see things. And third, be involved. Kids who serve others had adults who serve them. That's just something I've just kind of seen, that the kids who had adults serve them typically tend to serve God as they get older. They see that example. As we get ready to close this morning, I want to encourage us to find ways to leave the imprints that God has put on us on the people around us. To find ways to take that imprint that God has had on our lives, and how can we put that into the lives of other people? How can we let them see that? How can we let them experience it? Maybe it is just a simple inviting somebody to church. Maybe it's noticing that there's a family in your neighborhood that is struggling and their kids are just running amok. And we need to find a way to come alongside of those parents and encourage them and tell them that we love them, that we care about them, and that we're praying for them. Maybe as we're a parent and we see another parent struggling with their kid, maybe it's just a private prayer that we are praying that they will see God through us. Maybe it's putting our time and energy into serving in one way or another. Whatever that is, whatever way that God has put an imprint on you, I'm encouraging you to find a way to put that same imprint on the people around you. As we get ready to close